Okay, so with that, if everyone's ready, I'd like to start when I can. Um, I have 7 minutes, 30 seconds on my clock, and I'll just start it after the introduction. So, hello, Judge. My name is Noam Gross, and I'm going to be the first and third speaker for the government side, and my time is going to start right now. So, first of all, we're going to define this house as a rational actor, and I think that seems pretty logical given the motion. And the framework is going to be what's better for society overall, especially looking at it through the lens of morality, right? And then we also kind of want to define morality. So, morality refers to actions that most people would agree are better than some of the alternatives, right? So if you want to say one action has more morality than the other, it's just what the average number of people would say, okay, yes, action A is objectively more moral than action B. Okay, and that's all we have on top of case. We're just going to get right into our first contention, which is going to be on flexibility. And our main idea here is that having the framework that there's a significant distinction between doing and allowing is going to allow for greater subjectivity in assessing morality. And that's going to lead to more flexible and more accurate moral decisions. So, judges, when we decide to ignore the clear divide between doing an immoral action and passively allowing an immoral action to occur, we define morality as being something much more simple than it actually is. And that's going to lead to us adopting an oversimplified view of justice and life as a whole, especially over a societal lens. So that's a lot of complicated words right there. But what's an actual practical example of that? Well, okay, imagine a doctor intentionally chooses to give a patient a drug that directly causes their death. I'm sure we've all heard cases of this, right? This is viewed as murder by both the general populace as well as the legal system. Conversely, it's much more morally acceptable for doctors to withdraw life support at the request of a patient, or if the patient is unable to give consent at the request of their family. Now, in both these instances, the harm caused is the same. A person dies in a situation where it was not 100% confirmed they would have died. A patient, say, on life support, it's not confirmed that they're going to die, but the choice to withdraw life support makes it certain. This is pretty much the same as a patient that is being injected with a drug which is designed to kill them. The harm is the same. However, are these two actions morally equal? Judges, absolutely not. One is viewed as murder in the highest degree, whereas the other is viewed as an acceptable and even an ethical choice. So, what are the impacts of not making this distinction? I mentioned this before, but I want to reiterate. If we as a society don't make a distinction between these two cases, we are treating these doctors as well as the family members that allow life support to be withdrawn from their loved ones to be placed in the exact same morality bracket. That's the exact same way we view their morality as the worst murderers and serial killers. I think we can all agree that's just not true. Without this distinction, we would, as a society, be punishing moral individuals as though they were completely reprehensible. That is absolutely something that we cannot have. And this line of logic is also supported through the legal lens. So imagine another situation where a driver intentionally hits someone with their car, right? They see someone and they drive right into them. That is viewed as a much more serious offense than as if a driver were to see someone injured on the side of the road and fail to call for help. Now, obviously, you shouldn't do both things. But while I don't know the specifics, the legal implications on the first example should be and almost definitely are much greater. Even though both cases, the harm is the same. This person will probably die by the side of the road, whether they're hit by the person who was driving or if the person who drove by them simply ignored them. The harm is the same. However, I don't think any of us believe that the legal implications should be exactly the same, and therefore neither should the moral implications. Now, because of this, on magnitude, op loses nuance in any sort of complicated moral situation. This, sorry, op loses nuance in a complicated moral situation, which devalues the idea of it devalues the idea of morality in society as a whole, as well as in the legal system. And now on to our second contention. This is on moral security. So the doing and allowing distinction is essential for people to have moral security, meaning that they don't have to act like someone, say, getting kidnapped is as bad as them doing the kidnapping themselves. For example, if someone gets kidnapped, you don't personally have to feel guilty as though somehow you're in the wrong for an action that was entirely out of your control. In the op world, we are essentially just letting people think that all of the crimes that are being committed in the world are somehow their fault just because it occurred. Now, you live in a world where you have to deal. Now, in the op world, you're living in a situation where you have to deal with this impossible guilt on your shoulders. The comparative in our world, the gov world, is that people know that there's an objective difference between killing someone and someone in their neighborhood being the victim of some crime. Now, this could be complicated to understand, but it's really quite simple. If someone you know, say you said, oh, you told your friend, let's go to this place, right? And then they went to that place and ended up getting killed. If you hadn't told them to go to that place, they wouldn't have gotten killed, right? But are you at the same level of fault as the person who pulled out the gun and shot them? I really don't think so. I don't think anyone in this Zoom call would think so either. So judges, what this really comes down to is scenarios, right? Specific scenarios for specific instances. Do you really want to blame yourself, for example, for a kidnapping just because it was in your neighborhood and you weren't at the right place and at the right time to prevent it? Or do you want to be able to move on from that, considering that kidnapping was really never related to you in any way, shape, or form? In other words, how much guilt are you willing to take for this one action? In the opposition world, since we lose all nuance, we get to a situation where you're taking on all the guilt for every single action which happened around you. Now, of course, this is an exaggeration, but it's an exaggeration that could easily happen when we throw out all moral nuance. We have to be able to have a moral system which is more capable of judging objective morality. And it doesn't just say, okay, if one action was committed around you, or you did this one thing which may have possibly led to another thing occurring, you are equally at fault as though you were to personally go in there and do that incredibly immoral action yourself. So with that, I do not have much time left. I will see the rest of my time, but I strongly urge you judges to vote a government ballot based on the ideas of moral flexibility and based on the idea of moral security. Thank you very much.
Okay. Is everybody ready? I'm Monica, by the way, from Dalton. Okay, if that is the case, then my time will start now. Hi, I'm Annika. A lot to get through in the speech. I want to start on the top of case with what the government tells you. Then we have our own kind of characterizations we want to make about ethical frameworks, then two contentions, and then on to the government case. So the government side comes out and they tell us that morality is what society agrees upon. I think this is pretty preposterous. Let me give you three reasons why their populist model of morality is really, really awful. We think society's moral sensibilities change constantly. Think imperialist Europe, think slavery era America, think Jim Crow era America. We think a lot of the time popular thought is not correct, is not moral, is not ethical, and is not a good model to base moral and ethical frameworks off of. We think, secondly, societies justify atrocities because of groupthink, because of mob mentality. It's not clearly an ethical or logical thing to do, but they're going to do it anyway because a mob can force a change that isn't rational. Thirdly, we think there's a lack of thought. Most people don't think much about philosophical framework, so basing your framework on the random vibes of a group of people seems like a terrible idea. So what do we think this debate is actually about? We think this is around about ethical frameworks. It's about the question of whether or not doing versus allowing is something people should consider in their ethical decisions. Because we get this kind of insane definition of what morality and ethical frameworks look like, I want to give you three reasons or three things we think ethical frameworks should have to be good ethical frameworks. Our first property is not internalized. We think it is not about your own thoughts about yourself. We are not worried about guilt or your own feelings, just what you do. We think this is because you can't control your own thoughts. Our second thing we think every ethical framework should have as a property is being verifiable. This means it can be tested. You know what will happen. Otherwise, the system fails as an actual decision-making system because you have no way to know what's right or wrong. And the third thing we think an ethical framework should have is well defined. We think the terms of what the ethical system uses should be very, very clear. Otherwise, the system fails to be useful in making these decisions in the first place, and then it's not an ethical framework because it's not useful in the practical world. We think the point of this debate is to prove whether the opposition's moral or ethical framework can fall under these categories, and we're going to try to prove that the government side really cannot. So to kind of do this immediately, that's what our first contention is all about, which is the murkiness of allowance. And I want to tell you about a little theoretical experiment. Let's say you have an army and there are foot soldiers and generals and corporals and etc. And the generals order the corporals, order the foot soldiers to invade a village. And the foot soldiers then go and pillage this village and kill all the villagers. Is the soldier allowing an order to be carried out? Is the general allowing a village to be killed? It is not really clear who is doing the allowing and who is doing the doing. An unclear moral framework fails to provide our society with morals or ethics because you're never able to evaluate a decision. You're never able to figure out who was doing good and who
POI.
was doing bad. The second thing, sorry, what'd you say?
POI.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so in like wars and conflicts like this, do we not punish the generals differently than the foot soldiers? And do we not have a whole system for evaluating the morality of each of these people's actions when a horrible atrocity like that is committed?
Yes, I think the legal system does seek to kind of provide some sort of ideas of this, but I think the reality of this during war and in a military base is really confusing, right? If you were the village and you saw the foot soldiers pillage your village and kill the people, you think they are doing something ethically wrong, but you don't understand the whole general things. Then, on a more personal level, should the foot soldiers feel bad for what they are doing? Often these foot soldiers do not because they're being told that it was just the orders that they were given and that they're just following orders. They're not in the wrong. But our side would say that they are definitely in the wrong because they are killing people and they're making that choice and they are doing that thing. And it is the outcome that matters. We think that this ability to kind of scapegoat yourself only exists on the government side, and the opposition side gets rid of this ability to scapegoat. People who kill people, people who order the killing, all of these levels are guilty, and we're able to have a lot more clarity here. The second kind of example I want to give you is talking about bright line. What is your responsibility to know things? Because at the heart of what allowance is how much you know. Do you know that something is going on? Are you ignorant to it? And how does this level of knowing, what is our bright line between not knowing something such that you are not guilty and knowing something but not doing anything such that you are medium guilty and knowing something and doing something about it and such that you're really guilty? What is our bright line? So let's say you're walking down the street and there's a drowning child and you walk right by. But let's say you didn't see the drowning child. Are you still guilty? Are you still guilty if you didn't see them because you were trying to avoid eye contact with the homeless person that was standing right next to the drowning child? This again becomes really murky. We want to look away from bad things as humans. The government side allows for that, does not punish that. The opposition side forces people to not look away. We think a lack of clarity is really bad because it's hard to learn good morals and make good actions. It's hard to learn from what you have done. It's hard to make the right decision in the first place. Our second contention is that outcome is what matters. The outcome of your actions is what has an effect on the world, and we think that is what an ethical framework should be about. Looking back to my thought experiment about the drowning child, if you walk by the drowning child and don't stop to help that person, you are in the wrong. It would have taken zero risk on your part. It would have taken very little time out of your day. But not stopping and just allowing that to happen has the same level of harm as if you dropped that child in the water in the first place. Similarly, the trolley problem, the most used problem about thinking about these sorts of frameworks. Turning that lever and choosing to kill one person is obviously the right decision to make over allowing five people to be killed. But the government side wouldn't necessarily agree. We would agree that killing less people is always going to be less bad. We do not care whether you have nightmares about that afterward. We would always prefer for less people to die. The opposition side uniquely solves for that. We think you can become better over time with this form of moral framework because you see bad outcomes occur, and that is direct feedback to change your actions. Similarly, when it is clearly defined versus when it isn't clear, it is always empirically verifiable. Even if you get into some sticky situation, our side type of ethical framework will always give you an answer. Okay, now let's move on to the government side of this debate. They start with the contention about flexibility. I've already kind of talked about this in my own case. I think part of this is more about scapegoating than really about flexibility. And then the other part is that they give this example about the doctor. But we think that really in this example, it is the bigger difference is whether the patient is consenting to death versus not. It is not a question of allowance versus not allowance. If the doctor withdrew life support without patient's consent or gave the patient a drug that killed them, those would both be bad. Also, we would think that both of these are actions as seen as actions, one would assume in the government world, so they wouldn't really be viewed differently. Frankly, I think my lack of clarity is a testament to the murkiness of the government's moral frameworks. On the legal side, we think legal systems should not influence ethical frameworks, but ethical frameworks should influence legal systems. Yes, a different legal system would exist in the opposition world, but it would be complete across society because our ethical system would influence what our legal system would become. Lastly, on their second contention on moral security. They talk about being kidnapped. You will feel if your friend gets kidnapped because you sent them to a restaurant, you should feel really guilty. You would feel really guilty in this world. Firstly, we'll tell you that the amount of guilt you feel doesn't really matter. Ethical frameworks about telling you what is right or wrong. We don't really care what your personal processing of this right or wrong is. We just care about there being a way to evaluate your actions. Secondly, we'll tell you you are exactly at the percent fault of the chance they could have gotten killed or kidnapped at that restaurant. With all moral frameworks, things can be more right or more wrong. If you allowed your friend to go down a dark, shady alley alone, your percent wrong is higher than if you allowed them to walk into a very crowded and safe and securityed mall. We think that the government side allows for this because even though you didn't have an active participation in their killing, by allowing your friend to walk home alone at 2 a.m. in the morning has much more repercussions than allowing your friend to walk into a mall in the middle of daylight. The government side uniquely allows for this to happen, haha. And
Yeah.
for opposition side, it usually allows for all this to happen. For all those, I urge an opposition ballot. Thanks.
All right. I am Amar. I'm the second speaker for the government side on this debate, and I'm just setting up a timer. My time will start on my first word. And okay, so judges, I want to speak a little bit about this round, right? I want to zoom out a bit before I get into like more nitty-gritty attacking and some defense. I want you all to keep the doctor example my partner gave in his first speech in mind, as the op literally just tried to disprove it. And I think it's a really, really important example to keep in mind throughout this round, right? I think it's really hard for opposition side to say that in both cases, the doctor is making a morally equal decision, right? If you pull the plug on life support, right, because the patient requested it, versus like, I mean, like if you pull the life support off of some patient because, you think it's a morally equal decision to pull the life support versus, just letting the patient die, I guess, then that's kind of crazy, right? If you give the patient some drug that kills them without their consent, and you're saying that's equal to, just letting the patient die, even though you're trying to help them, but you can't really do anything about it, that's really, 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 I would say immoral to say, right? And that's something that I want to get more into throughout my speech. So I will definitely be bringing that up again. And then the second point that I want to more broadly talk about is this entire ethical frameworks thing that Ob brings up, right? They say that the three most important things in an ethical framework should be like that it's not
You
inter
alive?
no, sorry, I'll take it at the end.
Okay.
Not they say that the most important thing is like it's not internalized and that you're not worried about your own thoughts about yourself and that it should be verifiable, it can be tested, and it should be well defined. And the terms of the system and the terms the system uses should be very, very clear, right? They say that the point of this debate is to prove whether the opposition's ideas, so our ideas, the gov's ideas, can prove like this ethical framework to be true and like, working well, right? So if we go into like what they said on their contention one rebuttals, right? This is a great, like when they rebutted our contention one, they kind of answered something they said about ethical frameworks here. And more specifically, what I'm talking about is they said that legal systems shouldn't like influence ethical frameworks, but rather the other way around, right? Now, this kind of allows for very unjust mass punishment, what they said here, and this is completely against the whole notion of an ethical framework. So they're really just contradicting themselves here, right? And the reason for that is because if you allow ethical frameworks to influence legal systems, you're going to get some kind of country like North Korea, like some insane dictatorship, because ethical frameworks are much more subjective than the law itself. And just saying that you're going to set up very clear and well-defined terms doesn't actually mean anything in the real world, right? They talk about the trolley problem, but where do you see the trolley problem actually happening in the real world, right? So this entire thing about ethical frameworks is really, no, I'll take it at the end, is really hard for me to understand in this debate. And I'm, of course, going to go more into this as, my speech goes on. So going into their case, right? Going into their contention one on murkiness of allowance, right? They gave us the general and soldiers example and who's at fault for attacking the village. But do we not know that the person who gave the order is in fact the person responsible, but also the soldiers that are killing the villagers are just as responsible for actually like doing that harm, right? Aren't these soldiers who are also have to kill so many people also just as much in the wrong as the general who gave the order? This entire murkiness of allowance thing doesn't make any sense to me, right? For example, if we look at something like Nazi Germany, opposition is saying that it would be unclear if the German generals or the Nazi soldiers themselves are at fault. And I ask you, judges, isn't it both? Aren't both the soldiers and the German generals both at fault for killing that many people? This entire contention is extremely unclear to me, and I'm going to use similar logic on the drowning child, right? In fact, opposition seems to be kind of confused here in this example, right? Because government world is saying that that drowning the child with your own bare hands would be worse than just walking by. And they're kind of saying something different in this contention, right? In almost all cases, it would be true that drowning the child with your bare hands is worse than walking by because you have other cases. You have cases where you literally cannot help the child. For example, you have to walk by or run by because this might be in some kind of flood, right? It would kill you to jump in and save the drowning child. It's morally better to walk away because you don't want to kill both people. You don't want to kill yourself and the child, right? So they're really misconstruing what the drowning child means in the government world, and for that reason, their contention one should like be completely dropped, right? Now, onto their contention two about how the outcome of your actions is what matters, right? So like some kind of like deontologism kind of thing, right? They say that your actions is like what has an effect on the world, and that's what morality should be placed upon, right? But that contention too, which is about how like bad outcomes occur, allowing for objective moral change really matters in this debate, kind of flows through to our side because what government is saying here is that yes, outcome kind of does matter because if you're actively causing harm to a person, that's worse than just walking by. So yes, we are actually we totally agree with this, and I think this contention also doesn't really matter in this debate. That yes, we agree that outcome is what matters. Again, this goes back to the doctor example, which they tried rebutting, but they can't because if the doctor is going to give a drug that is going to actually kill that person, it is definitely worse than letting that patient die because you don't know how to help.
POI.
Okay, what's your POI?
What's the outcome at either side of the doctor example?
The outcome of either side, the outcome is like, okay, you have two outcomes, right? The first outcome is like you're giving the patient a drug that kills them, right? Which is what we're saying is morally worse than letting the patient die because you don't know how to help them. Those are two different outcomes in this scenario of the doctor. Moving on. Um, moving on, I'm going to respond to what they said about our case now, right? I'm going to go into some defense. So, their contention one rebuttals, I kind of already said this, right? When I was answering what they said about ethical frameworks, how this allows for mass punishment when they talked about how like ethical frameworks should be influencing legal systems, which is completely not true. And we definitely should not allow this to happen, right? So I kind of already talked about this. So I'm going to move on to something else they said, which is that like by allowing your friend to go to a bad place and getting killed, you do deserve the same blame. But that is like they're bringing up really weird edge cases here by saying that because what do you mean by allowing your friend to go to a bad place and getting killed? I mean, maybe that's the same thing as like killing them themselves, but what does that mean, right? I mean, there's obviously going to be more cases where you don't know that your friend is going to some bad place rather than you're purposefully leading them to some bad place, right? So even though you're technically like allowing them to be killed, if you know that they're going to a bad place and that they're going to be killed there, you might as well be doing that action to them yourself, right? That makes no sense. And also, when have you ever even heard of these kinds of cases of like leading your friend to a bad place so that you know like they're going to be killed or something? That like sounds like something you would see in a movie. And the same thing with the trolley problem. Everything they're saying doesn't really exist in real life, but we're giving you such concrete examples like the doctor that they're really not like able to respond to in this debate, right? So I think for all of these reasons, right, you should vote for our side. But just to like go on to some weighing here, with the rest of my time, I think that the gov world and the op world are incredibly different in this debates, like in so many different ways, right? And this world by world comparison is something that my partner will get more into in his third speech. But for now, judges, I think you should really think about the scenario that we mentioned at the end of our first speech. Do you really want to blame yourself for a kidnapping just because it was in your neighborhood and you weren't at the right place in the right time to prevent it, right? Is that really fair to you, judges? Is it fair to all of us to live with that immense guilt on our shoulders? And I ask opposition side to fully address this. How will you address the immense guilt of having to deal with the allowing of something to happen and the doing of something as the same, right? If you allow those things to be morally the same to you, how are you going to live with that guilt? Opposition is not addressing how that guilt is going to be taken off your shoulders in any way, how you're going to feel less guilty in the opposition world than you would in the gov world. And that is one of the biggest, most conceded points in this debate, judges. So, for all of the reasons I've just mentioned and the world by world comparison, which I urge you to think about throughout this debate, you definitely should give a government ballot. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Um, I'm Sam, second speaker on the opposition from Dalton. Everybody ready? Let's do it. Time starts now. My opponents lose this round when they make this round based on the existing ethical intuitions of people. Because this is around what makes a good philosophical framework, not about what people already believe today. Whenever my opponents get up and tell you about the current legal system we have right now, the current system we have right now, the current way people think right now, they miss the entire point. Because our legal system should mirror our ethical systems, not the other way around. The point is that we should do whatever people, that is not that we should do whatever people believe in now. Because when my opponents, when with their systems, with the ethical systems of we should do whatever people believe in right now, my opponents get up during imperialist Europe and say, no, there's no need to change. The legal system is working. My opponents get up in the center of Jim Crow in America and say, no, don't change. The legal system is working. But of course, it wasn't working. The whole point of this motion, frankly, the point of debate itself, is that the potential of philosophical discourse is not to reflect our society exactly how it is, but to give an opportunity for change, to ask what actually makes for a good framework and how do we construct one. So, what opportunity does OP provide? Let's get into it. I'm going to begin here on the top of opposition case. The top of opposition case, we read you three different key principles that are required for any kind of internally consistent moral framework. We tell you that first, a consistent moral framework has to be not internalized. We're not worried about your own feelings with yourself. You can't control your thoughts. We aren't interested in whether or not how you feel about certain actions that happen because you have no control. Like people literally can't decide the things that they think. Secondly, we tell you that they're verifiable. You need to know things will happen. You have to be able to evaluate whether actions are right or wrong. If you can't evaluate, the system fails an actual decision-making system. And thirdly, we tell you that it's well defined, that the actual words we are saying mean things as opposed to being totally arbitrary distinctions. This idea that this is the key framing of around, that this is the three properties that an ethical framework literally has to have for anyone to actually use it as a decision-making system, goes completely dropped by the government team in the MG. Don't let them make a new response to it in the PMR. There is no response to this. What that means in the round is that this is what we're looking at, are these three properties. Because Annika reads a million responses about this popularity thing, and I just did it in my speech, and we have these three properties. What does that actually say about the round? Let's move into each of these contentions. On the first contention from the opposition side about the murkiness of allowance, my opponents talk to you about, they say that they have a response because everybody is at fault in our general and army thought experiment. But no, when Annika tells you that the generals order the corporals, order the foot soldiers to invade the village, and then the soldiers go and kill the village, the point is not that who's at fault here. The point is that nobody can agree about who's allowing what and who is deciding what thing. Literally, Annika's whole question in this thought experiment is who is doing the doing and who is doing the allowing? Is it the generals? Is it the soldiers? And my opponents get up and they talk about Nazi Germany instead. They literally do not respond to this question whatsoever because there is no response, because there is no good distinction. Because the distinction, yeah, of course.
I mean, I did say that both the soldiers and the generals should be at fault for what happened. That's kind of the reason of why I gave that example.
Yeah, but saying both of them should be at fault is not at all the same thing as actually answering the question, who is doing the doing versus who is doing the allowing? Like, if you had an answer to that, you would have just POI'd me and told me what your answer to that was. Like, there's no answer. There's no good answer to this. Now, secondly, on this idea of like the bright line about what your responsibility to know things is. Here, my opponents do a key problem that runs throughout their case. My opponents say, look, the drowning child is worse than walking by. But the core problem here is that you have a response. So it's really hard to know what your responsibility is and the bright line for allowing. To allow something to happen, you need to have some kind of like awareness that that thing is going on and then not do anything about it. But the question of what is your responsibility to awareness is a totally arbitrary one. Anybody in this round can come up with thought experiments that give you an intuition towards one side or another, but it is only the opposition team that actually is a model for how ethical frameworks actually work. And the fact is that my opponents have no way of telling you what kind of responsibility you have towards what things you could reasonably allow to happen within your jurisdiction and not. The only answer is that there is no distinction, that there is not this like arbitrary bright line of at what point does allowing something start affecting your ethical experiments. On the second contention about outcome is what matters, the same problem exists here too. Yes, the outcome is what matters. We both agree on this, but the point here is we tell you that the ultimate priority is the actual outcome of your actions, because everything else is something that is arbitrary, internally decided, and my opponents literally drop what we tell you that in this speech, what Annika tells you about how over time you become better in an opposition world, and that secondly, that we actually are able to verify whether or not actions are good or bad. Whenever my opponents get up and tell you, look, we have the answer to this, everybody's at fault, my immediate question is, exactly how much and to what degree? Because as Annika tells you in her speech, actions aren't just right or wrong, but rather exist on a gradient, and there are things that are much worse than others or much better than others. And so whenever my opponents try to resolve ethical dilemmas by going, no, 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 everybody's at fault, that doesn't actually resolve the core contradictions of their case. Because the core problem of their case is that things will be more right or more wrong arbitrarily based on how we define or don't define allowing versus not allowing in any given situation. The only way to actually determine that kind of gradient is by looking at things we can actually verify, otherwise known as empirics and outcomes. Now, moving into my opponent's case. On my opponent's first contention, they read this doctor analogy that they open up their speech with. But there's two core problems with their doctor example. The first one is that it's not an example for their side. Their example of the doctor trying to save a patient and they die, and the doctor just like kills a patient. The doctor is doing things in both worlds. This example literally is not even for their side because the doctor is taking active actions. We may disagree on what allowing is, but even then, if you are confused about whether or not this analogy is doing versus allowing, then that's also a reason to vote for us on our first contention. But secondly, and even more importantly, this is a broader problem with my opponents in this round, which is don't let them con you here by giving you one example that fits your intuitions. Because look, we can play example tennis back and forth as much as we want in this round with different thought experiments, but it's only the opposition team who's an actual model of what it means to win the round and what it means to actually have a real ethical framework. We can both come up with things that give you intuitions one way or another, Judge, but it's only Op who actually is a model of what it means to win this round. Secondly, they talk about this idea of legal systems allowing for unjust punishment and that they shouldn't be based in ethics. But this is just not, legal systems are ethical systems. What do we mean when we say that Jim Crow was wrong? What do we mean when someone deserves the death penalty? That means we believe that that is an ethical decision they should do, or at least our legal system implies that that's an ethical intuition we have. A good legal system is a legal system that we derive from ethics, that we derive as something that is just and fair. If my opponents talk about consequentialism, that's just another ethical system too. There's no way any legal system that isn't based on ethical systems is a legal system which is quintessentially unethical and unjust. Now, on their second contention here about moral security, they talk about how things don't happen in real life. The first thing I say is, look, there's not that many serial killer doctors in real life. Like, this isn't like how we should do this. But secondly, these kinds of ethical decisions come up constantly in the real world. The question that we talk about in this round is, how responsible are you for giving somebody bad advice? That question comes up constantly in the real world. If somebody does something, you tell them to do something dangerous and something bad happens to them, how responsible are you? And Annika gives a really clear answer. You're exactly as responsible as the chance that something bad actually happened to them was. If you tell someone to do something safe and something randomly bad happens, you're fine. But if you tell someone to do something really stupid, something bad happens, then some of that responsibility fails on you. It's pretty simple. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Is everybody ready? Sounds great. Then my time will start now. There's a lot to get through in this speech, and we do a lot of different examples, a lot of different thought experiments, but I want to start you with the framing for how the next two speeches have got to go and what we've both got to prove to win our ethical framework. And that is something I tell you at the top of our case in my first speech. Sam's repeated it, but I want to go over it again. Firstly, we tell you it's not internalized. It's not about your own thoughts, which means all the stuff that the government side brings up about guilt is truly irrelevant. We do not care if you feel emotionally bad about what you do. We want an ethical framework that is beyond emotions, that is beyond acts of passion and feelings of passion. We would love you to go to therapy if you're feeling really conflicted about the actions you are doing. We still want you to be able to evaluate them in a rational way that is outside of you. Secondly, we want them to be verifiable. We want you to actually figure out what is right and what is wrong. We want you to be able to test this framework. We want you to get an answer back. My percent analysis achieves this. Thirdly, we want this to be well defined. We want this to be understandable. We want there to always be an answer, and we want you to be able to use this to make decisions. I think the fact that Sam and I have been able to answer the right and wrong of every single ethical dilemma that's been brought up in this round also proves this. So I think here on this dropped ethical framework analysis is your first vote for the opposition. So why is the opposition failing these? I think the opposition is failing these for the simple reason that it's extremely hard to evaluate the difference between allowing and doing. We've had no problem in this round figuring out that death is bad. We've had no problem in this round understanding that harm is bad. What we have had trouble with is figuring out responsibility, figuring out who is doing and who is allowing. What amount of knowledge is needed to assume someone is allowing? That is the question we ask when we give you our drowning child example. The answer to this is that we do not know, but we know that a kid has died, and in our world, the answer is pretty simple. That is bad. What amount of inaction is needed to assume someone is allowing versus not doing? We do not know, but we tell you that when this is our army example, but we tell you that villagers dying, that is bad. When an ethical system fails to be able to give a right and a wrong, fails to be able to be used in ethical dilemmas, it becomes a useless ethical system because we do not have ethics to rely on. We live throughout the world, in the government world, without getting ethical analysis back on our actions. Nothing is right or wrong because nothing is anything because they're still thinking about what their answer is. This is not a good way to live our lives. The opposition solves for this. So, what does the opposition society look like? What do ethical people in this world look like? Or, frankly, what do people in this world look like? We think people in this world are making more ethical decisions, and they're making decisions that they can trust in. Why do we think this is? It's because every single time they make a decision, they can run the same percent analysis I give you in my first speech, and they're able to figure out what percent badness does this have. They're able to test the scenarios. They're able to understand the effect of their actions. We think, secondly, they're able to get better at being moral. We don't think humans are all perfect, as we've proven with Jim Crow and as we've proven with slavery and as we've proven with imperialism. But the only reason we got out of that is because we were able to test our morals. We were able to figure out, oh, wait, I did this thing. I don't like the percent of badness I got back. I'm going to change what I'm doing in the future to get better. We don't get progress in the government world in the same way we get progress in the opposition world. That is another ballot for the opposition. Lastly, I feel like maybe the last offensive point that the government has is this point on flexibility and greater subjectivity. Here's why you will never value flexibility over any of the things I've said so far. We think you never value flexibility over any of these things because a greater subjectivity does not allow for getting better. Even if you believe that our ethical frameworks exist at the same plane, though I think we've proven that ours is at least the littlest bit better, you always prefer the opposition world because the oppositional world allows for it to get better. A rigid framework allows for improvement because there is actual response that is the same every single time. When something can get tested, it can get better, and flexibility does not provide that. So even if you think we're losing in this round, you still are voting for the opposition because our ethical framework can improve in a way the government side truly cannot. And for all those reasons, I urge an opposition ballot.
Okay, hello, my name is Noam Gross. I'm going to be the third speaker for the government case. And I have 5 minutes and 30 seconds on my clock, so I will just get into it in three, two, one, starting now. So on the key responses from the opposition's rebuttal to our case, they first say that we have no response to what can legally happen under some jurisdiction, and they say the ultimate priority is that the actual outcome of your actions. Yes, but Gov still wins here, as again, allowing for greater flexibility, as mentioned before, many times, is still fundamentally much more important to this idea. Then they say, Op asked, how much are soldiers at a fault and to what degree? Now, how does Op answer this question in any better method? How are ethical frameworks solving this question, and how would you implement these in the real world? Op gives us absolutely zero reasoning. Now, on the doctor example, they say we are allowing the doctor to do things, right? But the doctor is doing things in both worlds. And then they say that legal systems are ethical systems. This is just a repeat of some of their contentions. Now, I'm going to respond to that. First of all, if not for our current legal system, what other scenario would the opposition suggest? If the legal system is not governed by this general centric point of morality, which we point out in our framework, that people have at a current point in time, what is the alternative? I think we can all agree that our moral framework is much better than it was back in the Jim Crow era or any other time, any other of these terrible time periods. And therefore, it makes much more sense to have a base system of objective morality, which is based on what we all generally agree on now. Now, Op is essentially saying that something like North Korea's ethical system is working, and it's totally fine. I can say this because Amar mentioned it before. Number one, people have internalized this system over decades, right? In North Korea, it's been very internalized. Number two, it has been tested, and it is in use in North Korea. People are following it. And number three, it's well defined. This follows everything that was pointed out by Annika when she defined what a good legal system should be. So again, it is well defined. People in North Korea know exactly what they should or shouldn't do under Kim Jong-un's ethical framework. And then they go on to say that this should be influencing law. So they think that this ethical framework is completely fine to go straight into influencing the law of the country. Now, they never responded to the North Korea example because somehow it follows their rules, but we know it is objectively morally awful. Now, in the foot soldier example, Amar said that blame should be shared between the soldiers and the generals because they both did their own separate actions. Furthermore, in my POI, I mentioned that we have legal systems assessing the morality of perpetrators in this example, which allows for legal systems to demystify the idea that my opponents are saying is murky in one of their contentions. So it's not murky, it's actually very functional because we prove that we have a legal system based on ethical systems to determine what and who is actually at fault for which actions. So we are arguing that there must be a distinction between at what point does allowing something to start affecting your ethical experiments, because without this distinction, we devolve into dictatorial mass punishment, as well as this idea of snowballing guilt. As graciously was mentioned by Sam, actions are not just right or wrong. Nuance is absolutely required. However, we would all agree that there are verifiable examples mentioned before where nuance is central to assessing objective morality. This example is not for the opposition side, as they mentioned, because choosing not to do something is not at all an action in and of itself, because this would fully ruin the idea of this debate, right? It's way too technical and nonsensical for this thought experiment. We're saying whether you choose to do something or you choose whether to not do something. You can't just say, oh, they're both choosing to do something, because then we can't even have this debate right now. Legal systems are exactly as Sam mentioned, an ethical system. And as we mentioned before with cases such as the car crash, there are legal distinctions in this issue because there are fundamentally moral differences between the two things, which is exactly what we have been saying this entire debate. Yes, some responsibility falls on you if you deliberately tell someone to do something stupid and it leads to a negative consequence. But there is no way that we can buy that telling someone to do something stupid is the exact same thing as killing them, as is being mentioned by my opponents. They then say that internalized guilt is absolutely irrelevant. But judges, internalized guilt is not at all truly irrelevant, as is mentioned by my opponents, but it is fundamental for achieving a good moral system. All parties must be considered in objective morality. Everyone. My opponents, as they have mentioned, have not been objectively able to determine the correct moral side in every hypothetical. They make this insane claim. right? This is not true. Do not let them get away with it. They say that they can solve the trolley problem, which is something we talked about, and they said that they had a response to it. This is the most debated ethical like quandary of all time, right? Do the opposition really believe that they can just solve this in this debate? None of us in the Zoom call truly believe that. In the drowning child example, Amar already points out how allowing for nuance means we have a much better ethical and even legal system. Where is the warranting that nothing is right or wrong in the government world, as is stated by the opposition? Now, Judge, it's time to get into weighing. In our world-by-world comparisons, opposition allows for highly oppressive dictatorialism and universal punishment for any crime. This would lead to high levels of oppression throughout society, and it would make our legal system much less nuanced, and it would take away from the quality of determining any ethical decision in society. Now, in the government side, we continue with the status quo and we continue judging moral situations as they are based on the objective choices that each person has made, which sounds like a much better and much more viable solution. And for that, I urge a government ballot. Thank you.
Good round.
Thanks. That was a really fun round.
Great round, guys.
Yeah, everybody, great round. Awesome.